Caffeine is a global commodity that has long been associated with the enhancement of mood and information processing. While many products like ice cream, chocolate, and soft drinks contain varying amounts of caffeine, caffeine is widely consumed for its stimulant-like effects. The perceived benefits of caffeine are often in the forms of short-term increases in cognitive performance and mood. While consumption of caffeine is associated with increases in cognitive performance and mood, the effects of caffeine on human disease and pathologies have been examined considerably. By 2050, it is estimated that 130 million people will be tormented by a chronic illness called dementia. Dementia, a progressive neurodegenerative disease, works slowly over time to first dismantle one's short-term memory, speech, and then progresses to a complete loss of voluntary physical abilities like swallowing and spontaneous breathing. With dementia becoming a public health issue, new research has been conducted to combat the chronic illness. While there are several current and new medications available for persons with dementia, treating dementia must begin before the disease manifests. Dementia prophylaxis is becoming an exciting avenue for research. While the short-term effects of caffeine on cognition have garnered a significant amount of research, new studies are beginning to examine the long-term effects of caffeine consumption. Ultimately, the studies are examining whether caffeine consumption provides a protection from cognitive diseases like dementia. Specifically, this analysis paper will examine how the consumption of caffeinated beverages influences cognition in older adults. Ultimately, through the examination of meta-analysis of observational studies and systematic reviews, one can evaluate the consistency of findings to determine whether caffeine consumption influences cognitive decline over time.
So what databases were used and searched? So for our group, the search strategy involved using the databases supplied by Capital University, which included Google Scholar, PubMed, Medline, and ProQuest. Then the researchers used a large collection of databases on the Blackmore online library. Some were the relevant search terms used. So when utilizing these databases, the terms searched for were caffeine, coffee, and caffeine consumption. When searching for terms related to cognition, the terms searched were dementia, Alzheimer's, and cognition. Cognition was further broken down into cognitive function, performance, and impairment. Once these articles were collected, the researchers then combined the terms. For instance, articles or journals utilizing the terms caffeine and dementia in the title were subsequently collected. And then further selections of the type of articles were conducted by reading the titles and abstracts. And that's essentially how the articles were selected. And once those titles and abstracts then incorporate the specific search criteria that we just identified, we then deemed them compatible by the committee. Other criteria involved in finding the articles we were looking for articles that utilized a randomized control trial, meta-analyses of observational studies, or systematic reviews. So what are the inclusion criteria? The inclusion criteria utilized for the study involved finding articles that directly related to either dementia or caffeine. In terms of specific criteria, articles I found meta-analyses of randomized control trials, meta-analyses of observational studies, or systematic reviews. Exclusion criteria involved removing articles that involved a non-randomized control trial, case studies, or observational reviews that are strictly observational reviews. Articles that were evaluating a number of exposures, multiple exposures from caffeine, except coffee and tea were excluded, so like that'd be chocolate or other things that we have in our daily life that contain caffeine, because we had the inability to be able to prove that caffeine had a single effect on cognition. Articles that involved a discussion around ice cream, candy bars, and soda drinks were excluded as well. And part of the selection process, again, I'll just go over this, the articles And the number of articles appraised were 4, and the ones that we chose were the caffeine intake from coffee or tea and cognitive disorders, a meta-analysis of observational studies. We selected coffee consumption, risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, a dose-response meta-analysis. Our next was coffee, caffeine, and health outcomes, an umbrella review. And our final selected article was caffeine intake, dementia, systematic review, and meta-analysis. So the synopsis of articles appraised, including measurements, samples, and results, and what are the strengths and limitations of each article. So for the first article, caffeine intake from coffee or tea and cognitive disorders, a meta-analysis of observational studies. So essentially, giving you a brief overview of this study, was the researchers used observational epidemiological studies such as cross-sectional case control and cohort studies, and they looked at how they have reported inconsistent findings regarding the association between caffeine intake, coffee and tea, and the risk of cognitive disorders such as dementia and Alzheimer's disease, cognitive impairment, cognitive decline. And what they essentially did was try to combine all of these studies. And some of the methods that they used to find these studies in the first place were PubMed and Embase. 3 evaluators independently extracted and reviewed articles based on their predetermined selection criteria. Out of their results, out of 293 articles identified, 20 were epidemiological studies, which involved over 31,479 participants. And the pooled odds ratios, or relative risk of the caffeine intake from coffee or tea, was 0.82 with a 95% confidence interval. So some of the strengths and sample characteristics was the article's ability to assess for methodological quality. So essentially what they did was, with each article that they appraised, they assigned, based on a set of criteria, they awarded articles so many stars, with 8 being perfect. And overall, out of all the studies that they examined, the average star that was awarded was 6.8. So the precision or the methodological quality of each article was high. Also, in terms of the sample characteristics, with 31,479 participants, it is really good. Having a large sample size will help make the results more precise as well. And the inclusion of multiple studies could be seen as a strength as well. The researchers went out of their way to find different types of models, different types of evidence to help support their claims. So some of the limitations with this article was that they only considered coffee and tea as a source of caffeine intake. Therefore, there was a limitation regarding the generalization of the findings regarding the effect of caffeine intake on the risk of cognitive disorders such as AD and dementia. Second, it was really hard to evaluate the exact amounts of caffeine intake for each study because multiple people drink multiple, or the amount of caffeine contained in a cup of coffee ranges, and the way coffee is prepared is different as well. So the results for this meta-analysis found that caffeine intake from coffee or tea was not associated with the risk of cognitive disorders. And this is an important distinction because, especially for our PICO question, is because essentially one is unlikely to develop a cognitive disease from caffeine. Thus, we know that we must be able to rule out that dementia and Alzheimer's disease are not being caused by caffeine. And that's an important distinction to make moving forward, especially if we want to look at whether or not caffeine is actually reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So, moving on to the next article, this is Coffee Consumption and Risk of Dementia and Alzheimer's Disease, a dose-response meta-analysis of prospective studies. So essentially, the researchers performed a dose-response meta-analysis to summarize the prospective data on coffee consumption and associated risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And some of the methods that they used to identify these articles were by searching databases such as PubMed, and they did this all the way back from January 1966, and Web of Science from 1945 all the way up to October 4th, 2018. And they also scrutinized the reference list of the pertinent publications. In order to do this, two researchers independently reviewed the literature, and the results were combined using a restricted cubic spline or random effects dose-response meta-analysis based on a one-stage approach. And 8 relevant prospective studies were identified out of this search. In terms of the sample size, these studies included 7,486 dementia cases diagnosed among 328,000 individuals during an average follow-up of 4.9 to 25 years. And a meta-analysis of all 8 studies indicated no statistically significant association between coffee consumption and the risk of dementia. And the relative risk of dementia per 1 cup per day increment of coffee consumption was 1.09 with a 95% confidence interval, and the p equaling 0.37. The meta-analysis of 5 studies that focus on Alzheimer's disease also revealed no association between coffee consumption and Alzheimer's disease, and no deviations of a linear trend with a p of 0.79. So essentially, these results found do not support an association between coffee consumption and increased risk of overall dementia or Alzheimer's disease specifically. But really interestingly, one of the studies that this article analyzed was one that found that showed daily versus no daily coffee consumption was associated with a reduction of 31% in the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is important because while this is similar to the previous article above, this one started to begin finding that there might be some association with a reduction of cognitive disorders like those of Alzheimer's disease. Now, in terms of the strengths of this article, a strength of this meta-analysis was based on the fact that it utilized articles starting back from the early 1945s all the way up to 2018. And it made sure to utilize inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. And when reviewing those 8 prospective studies, the utilization and adjusting for confounding variables such as age, sex, gender, and ethnicity were key components of these research articles. Now, some of the limitations obviously goes back to only 8 studies being identified. Just looking at that number from between 1945 until now, only having 8 studies on this topic is you would expect to see more. Another limitation of this meta-analysis was that some of the articles that out of the 8 prospective studies, some used self-reported coffee consumption, and based on our research, self-reported coffee consumption leads to measurement errors, which may have resulted in attenuated results. The exact amount and concentration of the coffee consumed are difficult to measure by a questionnaire, and therefore this particular meta-analysis may not have captured the true dose-response relationship between coffee consumption and dementia risk. Likewise, the diagnosis of dementia and AD also differed among the studies, and there might be some degree of misclassification of dementia. Thus, going based off that, it is interesting to note what I stated earlier, that some of the studies found that there was a reduction in Alzheimer's disease, which makes this research article very applicable to our RICO question. And now Dre is going to do the next 2 articles for you.